Hello everyone and welcome back to Noia Dev, the series that aims to prove that one developer can create a successful MMO RPG. My name is Dane, and this week on Noia Dev, we're talking about a whole lot of random stuff, actually. A good chunk of my time these last 2 weeks has been devoted to optimizations. Now, normally, optimizations come towards the end of a game's development lifecycle. Get the game working first, optimize after all the main systems have been created. And while this is true, some of these changes that I made were desperately needed. First up is the way the game loads assets on launch. Up until now, all assets loaded on application launch, and this is what that looked like. The Unity loading bar would hang at the last 10% and sometimes hang for so long that the operating system or web browser would think that the app had crashed and prompt you to close it. It would finish loading eventually, but you can see why application hang pop-ups are generally frowned upon. The problem is with this block of code here, it would run through all of the loadable assets and load them in one single frame. Quests, NPC dialogues, achievements, and biggest of all, items. It would never give the game time to catch its breath, so to speak, so it would look like it froze. The fix I implemented with this was to leave all of these assets unloaded until login. Once the login button is pressed and the server has authenticated that client, the asset load starts. After each asset is loaded, it breaks the loop and allows that client to catch up for 1 second before loading the next group of assets. You can see the scrolling background hitch a little bit during this loading process, so I might change the background during that asset load process to something a bit more static. Regardless, this works. The game launches much faster, and seeing a loading bar after clicking the login button is kind of an expected behavior, so this is all great. The next big optimization is with observers. Noia uses a network library called Mirror, and this is how Mirror syncs player data with other players. When two players are within range of each other, the server sends each player their relative data. When one player can see another, they are called an observer. Usually both players are observers of one another. Now, when a player starts a dungeon, they are given a special number called an instance ID. If two players' instance IDs don't match, their sprite renderers are turned off. They're still observers of each other, though. They just can't see each other. The server is still sending player data to both players because they're in close proximity to one another. This same issue occurs with monsters too. This means if 30 players were running separate dungeons, each one of them would be receiving monster data from every other dungeon instance. Until now. It took me a while to wrap my head around how Mirror processed player observers, but once I grasped the concept, I was able to add additional criteria, and now, if players or monsters do not share the same instance ID, they are not allowed to observe one another. So this is going to greatly reduce the amount of data the server needs to send to players in more crowded areas. And last but not least, I fixed monster animation jitter. Bosses would sometimes jitter between idle and casting animations, and this was mainly due to how Unity handles its animation trees. When the monster is casting a skill, it would set this flag, and when the animator sees that that flag is set to true, it would play the animation. Problem is, sometimes the animator would still see the flag set as true even after the spell was finished casting. So it would flip-flop between this casting animation and the idle state, and this would result in this jittery effect at the end of every spell. The fix for this was to trigger animations programmatically rather than letting the animator handle it. Rather than setting a flag and waiting for the animator to notice, you simply tell the animator what to play the moment you want it to play. And ta-da! Look at that! No more jitter. Enough of the optimizations. Let's talk about some of the new lore stuff. You're all familiar with this cutscene, right? Queen of the Underworld curses the player. There's plenty of dialogue here to explain what's going on, text, and even voiceover, but there's nothing to actually show that the player was getting cursed. And now there is.
You shall be my emissary. This brand marks you as mine.
The queen now has a casting animation and this new magic circle appears. And then the player is cursed by a giant laser. So let me explain. When the player is cursed, they fall unconscious. So I needed a spell sprite that looked powerful enough to knock out the player. Hence, big column of evil energy. The player then wakes up in the forest next to Dan. You guys remember Dan, right? He was in your pocket the whole time. You picked him up. Yeah, anyway, Dan is going to serve as sort of a guide to the player. And in this cutscene, Dan sets the player onto the next part of the main story quest. First step, find some place to rest. You just got cursed by a giant column of death. Maybe you should take a nap about it. He even points out Norman and Elva's farmhouse off in the distance. Once the player finds the empty bed inside of the farmhouse, Dan will be available to answer some of the player's more burning questions. Who was that? Who are you? Why am I cursed? What the heck is an emissary? And most importantly, what do we do now? This question and answer conversation with Dan should serve as the end of the tutorial for the game. At this point, the player should have a good grasp on how most of the game mechanics work, and a general understanding of the driving force behind the lore of the game, and an overarching main quest line to break their curse. What do you guys think of all these changes? Let me know down in the comments. And that's it for this week. A lot of technical stuff this week, and a handful of cutscenes, but I'm pretty happy with the progress that's been made so far. On another note, Clockwork Raven has actually begun work on a new commissioned tile set, the Glowing Mushroom Caves. If you've looked at the Millinote map, you can see it off to the side of the town. I'm really excited to get working on that. I've also been working on some new camera tricks. If you're in the Noia Discord, you've probably seen that in the No Zero Days channel, so I'm really excited to get back to that to see if I can make that happen for Noia. I gotta get back to work, so I'll see you next time.